Hello, friends. Welcome to another Word of Gord. This time we're continuing on after an incredibly long break with the series Average Folks in the Afterlife, number 17, I think it is. And I'm going to approach a book that I haven't touched on before by the much celebrated, if only by the cognoscenti, Jürgen Zhu. He has done 3 books on meditation and consciousness projection, or if you like, out-of-body travel. And I'm going to be reading from the 3rd, Vistas of Infinity. He is an expert, or as close to an expert as we've got in the modern world, that's putting his experiences down for others to see and hear. And I think his work is completely cutting edge. There are very few people who seem to be doing this level of exploratory penetration of the various astral, mental, and causal realms. I've done some of this myself, and you find it in my books, but I think it's very important for you to see and hear what others experience, so it does not seem like it's just Gordon's view of things. In a philosophical sense, my own books are my view of things. It is my perception and my experience. But you will see from these readings, as you may have seen from earlier readings from other books, that my experiences overlap in a number of ways with the experiences of others. The astral realms are a series of consensus realities that are formed by the belief systems, conscious or unconscious, of those who live there. And as we know, if you've been following this series or any of my books, there are many types of dead people, just as there are of alive people, quote unquote. And each of those types, those groups, those patterns of behavior and beliefs tend to congregate with those who sympathize, who share their view of whatever it is they think reality is. And just as here on Earth, people share certain realities. For example, the people that I work with in a very regular type of job in Canadian society, I'm sure our worldview is not at all like the view of Pentagon generals or the staff of intelligence agencies or the workers for World Vision or Doctors Without Frontiers. Not to say one view's any better than another. We all share the planet, but we share it in interesting ways. And our friends, the jihadists, willing to sacrifice themselves for their internal vision of how things should be both here and there. They see things completely differently from the rest of us, I would say. So as you will see in the following readings, Jürgen discovers people on various levels and explores their reality and compares it to other experiences that he's had. And as this is his 3rd book, he's very confident, I guess, of his perceptions and his intuitions, and I don't blame him. I think he's right on the money. See what you think. Jürgen Zhu, Vistas of Infinity. These are journal entries from various points in quote-unquote time. And he is well practiced at both meditation and consciousness projection by this point in his journey. 5 April 2009. I got up at 5:30 a.m. to meditate. My wife Julia had already occupied our small meditation room, so I took a small easy chair next to my bed. All night I tried to work out in my dream how to present my knowledge of the other dimension in such a way that it would be acceptable to even the most hardened skeptics. Although my dreams seemed to yield some plausible solution, now fully awake, they appeared to me to be outrightly absurd. So much for using dreams to promote practical solutions. For 10 more minutes I tried to close the whole subject I had spent most of my night contemplating, and then decided to let my thoughts go and gradually sink into deep meditation. At one stage, hypnagogic images started to emerge, and I pondered the idea of following these to gain entry into the next dimension by watching the emergence of a scene in my mind and then entering it lucidly. Instead, I dozed off. In my dream, it was in a dark scene and it rained heavily. The whole main road I was walking on was under 4 inches of water. My feet were wet as I trudged toward the town centre. About 200 feet in front of me, I saw a hill of water. The sight was so absurd that I instantly realized that I was dreaming. At that moment, the rain stopped and the water disappeared. With the dream narrative disintegrating, I acquired full waking consciousness. I focused on my right hand until I saw every pore of my skin very clearly. I challenged myself to see how far I could resolve the detail of my skin, and I was amused to find that by doing so, I played an active part in the creation of my hand, which solidified via billions of dancing light particles and atoms. I played an active part in the creation of my hand. Take note. However, as I looked up, I found that although the rain and the water had stopped, the surroundings I found myself in were distinctly dark and unpleasant. Some shadowy characters were moping around, seemingly oblivious of my presence. I thought it was imperative to move away from this dark, sinister place and try to make it into a higher dimension, a place filled with light and beauty. As usual to do so, I chanted the Om mantra and was instantly swept off my feet and pulled into the sky towards a golden crack appearing within the clouds. At the same time, a shaft of light poured toward me and accompanied by the sweetest sounds imaginable. I might mention that a number of practitioners and explorers have used the Om mantra to such great effect. As I moved toward the opening, my enthusiasm began to wane. Inexplicably, I felt the urge to return toward the dark region I had just risen from. I was annoyed. Instead of scaling the lofty heights by following the sweet sound current into the higher dimension, I was compelled to submit to an irresistible urge and follow the very opposite direction, down. I had no choice in the matter at all. I was drawn by a deep instinct toward the group of shadowy characters I had seen and avoided before. I was already somewhat familiar with this strange urge that compelled me into the nether regions. Behind it, I always sensed a presence of benevolence, a kind of deep inner knowing that I had to do what had to be done and go where I was sent. Go where I was sent. As I drew closer, the appearance of those people reminded me of zombies from a horror movie, except they were not aggressive or threatening. They just looked hideous and rather depressed. They were more preoccupied with themselves than paying me any attention. I could not detect a single iota of positivity radiating from them. Their sight made me feel rather sorry for them, and instinctively I picked out one character among them who was covered in horrid green scabs and with skeletal features showing through the hideous surface of the diseased skin. Part of the flesh around the mouth was eaten away, revealing the craggy ruins of the teeth. Despite the hideous disfigurement, I could identify the character as female. She had no hair. Instead, her emaciated skull was covered in crusty disease scabs. The recognition that she was female had nothing to do with outer appearance, and for a moment I wondered how I arrived at this information. All I could feel was great sorrow and pity for her as she turned away from me when I approached, trying to conceal her shame, panic, and anguish. Nevertheless, I approached her with resolve. "Do you know where you are?" I asked her. She flashed her attention towards me, fearful and nervous. Somehow the compassion I felt for this sad creature allowed me a quick glimpse into her soul. Are we looking rather dark there? Maybe we are. Yeah, that's better. I seem to be stuck in a horrible nightmare and I don't know how to wake up, she said. Just by looking at her, I could read her like an open book. I immediately knew she was a prostitute and had died from a heroin overdose. Her life had been wretched and miserable, and only the drugs she was addicted to had offered her a very fragile and temporary relief. She had fallen victim to a crime syndicate and was offered easy drugs for a return of the profit she had derived from prostitution. She had tried to escape, but resorted to robbery and theft to feed her habit. Over time, all positive influence had disappeared from her life as her existence descended into a living nightmare. I'm sorry to say, but you have died, I said straight out, almost surprising myself by my directness, but there was no other way of approaching the subject. She looked at me in horror. I touched her shoulder as I tried to ease the blow. She pulled away and tried to hide her face from me in her hands. She was indeed a hideous monster for which it was hard to muster any sympathy, being so closely confronted by her disfigurement and the qualities which had materialized. The diseased scab on her face, parts cracked open to reveal the bare and brittle bone of her skull. There was no life force at all that would at least lend her a tinge of humanity, a fleck of natural skin. What I could see of her eternal experience was made up from anger, pain, frustration, and hatred for the people who had exploited her, and from deep anguish, resentment, and depression. Any hint of positive life force had been stripped away, leaving a sad, demonic creature as a remnant. Never before in all my life, neither in these dimensions nor on earth, had I such a close encounter with human depravity, and yet all I could feel was deep sorrow and compassion for such a lost life. Knowing that she was aware of how she must have come across and her state of mind, I put my arms around her and pulled her closer. She immediately broke down into heavy sobs and her whole body began to shake. I rocked her gently from side to side and then suggested we should take a little walk away from her group and I would explain what had happened to her. Still cradling her in my arm, we walked slowly toward the town centre, which was dimly lit. But even such a dim light appeared to be like a beacon of hope as we walked towards it. You have died of a heroin overdose, I told her, but you don't have to worry anymore. Your life is about to change. I told her that she was lucky that I had spotted her. Others might spend considerably longer in that state of mind and that dark place. The way you look and feel is a result of the unfortunate life you have led and poor choices you have made. I let her know that this was a new beginning for her now. For a start, she didn't have to worry about the wretched company she had kept, the criminal who beat and exploited her, and the loveless service she had offered to her clients. I did my best to comfort her when she broke down in tears again and started sobbing so violently that her whole body started convulsing. She slowly calmed down and began to tell me that her life had not always been that bad, and she regretted the life she had led and the things she had done to other people. While she cried in my arms, the compassion I felt released a deep-felt stream of love coming from my chest, and I could see for the first time the hideous scabs from her face and body slowly disintegrating and dissolving, and revealing the first semblance of a human being underneath it. Her tears seemed to wash away the dirt and sickness that had covered her until now. Meanwhile, we had reached the town, and the streets were lit much more brightly as we arrived. It was as if a rising sun had cast its first beams of light into the world and had begun to banish the demons of the night. We stopped in front of a shop which displayed a large mirror. I asked her to look into the mirror. To her astonishment, she discovered the human face of an attractive woman, though still lined. Her smile was open and genuine. Her skin colour was the normal rosy complexion of an average human being. Her joy was infectious. She squeezed my arm and I pulled her closer to me. I suggested we should talk a little more to discuss how she could make the most of her new life, and suggested we should sit down on a bench. By now it was daylight and we were looking at a park with a green lawn and trees and people wandering about just like in any park on earth. I was sadly aware that these were not the bright pastures of paradise, but on the whole a comparatively drab-looking park with big patches of dead grass. Nevertheless, in comparison to the place we had come from, this was some kind of oasis. I knew it would take a lot longer to adjust, and I told her that it was imperative for her to pay attention only to the positive feelings and not indulge in resentment or anger. Whenever she felt something like that towards her earthly tormentors, she should practice the art of forgiveness and seek out more positive thoughts. A bright future now lies before you, but it is up to you to make good choices with your thoughts and where you place your attention, I said. She nodded and smiled at me, stroking me gently and affectionately with gratitude. Suddenly my attention was diverted towards a woolly dryness in my mouth, and I pulled out some flowery tasting tissue paper that inexplicably seemed to have lodged there, but it did not stop the unpleasant feeling. A chap sitting on a bench next to us laughed uproariously as I tried in vain to remove more and more sticky tissue from my mouth. In the end I opened my physical eyes. My nose was blocked, and breathing through my open mouth had dried out my throat and caused the unpleasant sensation. I took a sip of water and tried to connect again to the scene, but it was too late. I could not return. Some thoughts by Jürgen on his experience. There was plenty to learn from this short episode. For a start, the old belief that there are 7 levels on the astral plane needs to be instantly deposited into the bin of misinformation. Whatever it originated from, experience of actual astral reality tells a different story. I found there are infinite layers which cannot be separated into stacked layers for the convenience of traditional understanding. The layers are in fact no layers at all, but subtle shifts into states which are neither arranged vertically nor laterally in any 3-dimensional way. We are drawing an environment towards us or draw into it, and the process can be gradual and quite unnoticeable. At any stage we may meet other people who happen to be there, and we may lose them the moment we are drawn into a more refined or gross state. I found this principle holding true throughout consciousness. The other lesson to be learned is that salvation from a state of consciousness can be almost instant or happen over long stretches of a particular experience, or appear as never-ending or infinite. I assume that some church mystics might have honed in on these extended stays in a negative mindset and referred to them as eternal hell. On closer inspection, these are just illusions and states of mind. And I certainly agree with all of that. States of mind are all there is. Until you get to the end of mental energy, and then you're into some other kind of state, which we could debate for some time about what that next state actually is. But for most of us, states of mind are all there is. The Living Art of Transformation, 23rd November 2008. I had 3 lucid events before waking up in the early hours at 4 a.m. In order to wake up myself fully so I would not fall asleep during meditation, I went into my studio to check on the rendering progress of a commercial job I had executed overnight. After about 20 minutes, I felt awake enough to retreat into the meditation room. Meditation was lucid, but I soon became aware of images emerging, and there was a real danger that they would pull me into a dream. I made an effort to stay awake, but the images kept reasserting themselves. I was tempted to enter them to see if I could retain an awareness by crossing over into the dream state fully conscious. Unfortunately, I simply nodded off. There was no hope on earth that I would maintain awareness, and because it was so early, I thought it would be wisest to go back to bed to catch up on a proper night's sleep. No sooner did I fall asleep when I became involved in some extremely surreal and vivid dreams. I woke myself up, and lying on my back, I decided the next time I fell asleep I would become lucid and establish myself on the next dimension with full awareness. I would then use this to meditate in the OBE state. Sure enough, I was asleep again, dreaming and trying to find my way out of a warren of prison-like corridors and rooms. When I found a half-open window, I decided to escape, but then my intent kicked in and I realized I was in a dream. I immediately established full waking consciousness by focusing on the wall in front of me until I could see every particle of the rough stone emerging into crystal clear perception. To my surprise, the new environment was not much less surreal. In fact, it was so weird that I wondered what kind of madman's world I might have entered when I observed a strange fantasy creatures walking around inside the long corridor of a modern building. I kept focusing to see if I could actually increase lucidity and thereby disperse the surreal events around me. I couldn't. I was as clear as I could be, and finally I identified the space I was in as the interior of an art gallery, simply by the atmosphere at first. The work on the walls, of course, reinforced my feeling, and then the visitors. And that was exactly what it was. I was immersed in a live performance of an art show where the performers and artists had creatively transformed themselves into unusual shapes, creatures and fantasy animals. Being an artist, this concept instantly cast a spell on me, and I was delighted that the people here made such a creative use of their transformative abilities. On our earth, all we can call on for transformation are elaborate costume and makeup. But these were shapes and costumes no human being would ever be able to fit into. Even the receptionist was a strange fantasy cockerel, but compared to what might be achievable on Earth, this was in a category of its own. A true metamorphosis from man into creature, into shapes, into living light displays, even where form morphed on a continuous basis in astonishing manifestations. I was spellbound by what was possible. This was a show so literally out of this world that I had not been fully awake. Had I not been fully awake, I would have simply discarded it as some kind of surreal dream. A kind of dream quite typical for deep REM sleep early in the morning. But here I was, excited, in full waking consciousness. Talking to other visitors, it was confirmed that this was indeed a show put on for the pleasure and entertainment of the local populace. Apart from the great pleasure this demonstration provided, it was made crystal clear to me how tentative our human experience is and how it is mostly habituation that makes us look the way we do. In non-physical reality, appearance can be altered by intent and the power of imagination. Indeed it can. When I came out of the building, I strolled straight into a grandiose square park of a capacious city. Right in front of me, I was faced with a large ornamental pool, beautifully laid out in coloured mosaic, with people swimming in it and others lazing around on its banks. Beyond the pond was a large park with a number of city blocks and formidable buildings encircling it in the distance in a somewhat picturesque fashion. Despite its extent, it still had the cosy small-town atmosphere of a Cornish seaside town like St. Ives in England, but here the similarity stopped. This place was very, very busy, and there was no lack of distraction or entertainment. So much so that I felt overwhelmed and thought what a pleasantly boring place our physical world was by comparison. I did not even begin to focus on any of the distractions on offer for fear of being overwhelmed by them and ending up losing my awareness and control over my increasing adventure. My keen eye for art and design allowed me to focus on individual features of this extraordinary city. For example, the exterior of the buildings were simply giant dimensional canvases for incredible expressions and how well even very intricate detail could be used on a large scale. Needless to say, stairs, lifts, or escalators were no longer a feature, and where they still existed, they were little more than ornamental. Despite that, people didn't simply fly around as one might imagine, even though in these realities it was a distinct option. I did, however, take advantage of this novel way of moving as I drifted along whole streets, enjoying the buildings close up and in detail. The atmosphere and feeling of this generated deep inside of me was quite new and profound. After a while, I remembered that this was a great opportunity to say hello to my mother, who I had last paid a visit to nearly 4 years before. With this thought, I called out for her with great warmth and affection, and very soon I was greeted by two very young and attractive women in their mid-20s. The only way I recognized my mother was by her aura and the feeling of her. Nothing of her outer appearance was anything that resembled the woman who had reared me, and who I had known all my life. It was as if she had undergone a total makeover, including cosmetic surgery, and redesigned every single detail of her appearance. I was struggling to find any characteristic at all which reminded me of her externally. This didn't stop her laughing, taking me into her arms, giving me a tight hug and kiss on the cheek. "Doesn't he look beautiful?" she said to the woman with darkish brown hair and a rather more solemn look standing next to her. To my absolute amazement, I realised it was her older sister, my Aunt Trudy. I was flabbergasted. Here in front of me were two women I had known all my life, who had then grown old, wrinkled, and worn down by the trials of life, one dying at 75 from a stroke, the other in her 80s from bowel cancer. And here in front of me were two vivacious girls, young, modern, and full of the spirits of youth. In the peak of her life, my mother had always been full of vitality, reminding me a little of my younger daughter. I had never known my mother was capable of such permutation, mainly because of all the hardships my parents had experienced when I was a child. Only on a few occasions had I witnessed her in vivacious mode when my parents had friends around for a party, and my father would play his guitar and friends would join in singing and drinking. When I got out of bed, sleepy-eyed, trying to find out what the noise was, I found a bunch of merry young people intoxicated by liquor and song. And this is how she was now. After our cheerful hello, I addressed my aunt to find out how she was. I also wanted to know if my mother knew where our father was, and she said, "We are not together much at the moment. He has moved on and he now spends a lot of his time almost secluded producing paintings." I looked at the turmoil in this world and could well understand that one could quickly tire of such distraction. My father had been dead for over 50 years, my mother for only just over 10. I could understand that she was keen to catch up and compensate the best she could for a life full of hardship by reliving a youth which had been taken away from her by World War II. My attention was then drawn again to my aunt, who, as far as I knew, had never been a fashion model, and now I was simply stunned by her young and modern appearance, in a fabulous, even hip, outfit. I knew my mother was the driving force of their companionship, my aunt tagging along, eager to find out what surprises my mother would come up with. I remembered that it was my mother who, with her old sewing machine, was very good at making her own clothing when we were children, so the designs were obviously hers, and I grinned from ear to ear seeing my dear aunt like this. My mother caught me and burst out laughing. "You are not laughing at me, I hope," my aunt responded. Both of them were radiant with joy and life. It is no surprise that they had changed so much. From childhood to old age, we all change and morph continuously. Some people even undergo extensive surgery and makeovers during their lifetime. It would be almost unnatural to expect people to keep their looks when they have at their disposal such magical powers for transformation, employing no more than the intent of thought and imagination. Unfortunately, our meeting was cut short when I was distracted by feeling of having chewing gum stuck to the roof of my mouth, which I tried to prise away while talking to my mother. In the end, I woke up with a dry mouth, caused by having slept breathing through my mouth with my nose blocked. I took a few sips of water, then laying on my back, ran through the experience in an attempt to remember as much as I could. I knew that if I didn't move, I was likely to return to a lucid dream. Before I did so, I decided on a task list to investigate the world in a bit more detail, rather than allowing myself to be dragged along by a course of events I had little control over. Unfortunately, my return did not materialize. Less than a year later, I met my mother again. Since I had moved to England in 1970, a year was about the average time span when I met up with my family in Germany. So one could say death hasn't changed the regular visits. The one thing I had tried on many occasions unsuccessfully to do was contact my father, who I had lost as a 9-year-old child. I finally succeeded, but not in the way I expected at all. Well, we'll get to that next time in a section called My Father Reincarnated. So, Jürgen Zhu, Vistas of Infinity. We'll be proceeding onward with this fine and exciting exploration of the other worlds that lie around us, waiting to be explored. So, not much to add to that, except I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll talk again soon.